Hey guys, Steve here at SKS Props, and not long ago I showed you guys how I built some pretty cool Chaos Blades out of foam. We're going to be tackling the Chaos Blades yet again, but we're going to be stepping it up a notch. This time we're going hand sculpted and resin cast. Like the first set of Chaos Blades I created, I printed off the line art that I had made in Photoshop so I could scale the blades properly. I transferred the templates to 1/4 inch Centra. Taping the two halves together, I took the Centra pieces over to my sanding station and refined the shape on my belt sander. I switched over to my Dremel to make sure that I could get all the detail areas just the way I wanted them. After all the templates have been cut out and glued together, I transitioned the layers using epoxy sculpt. This is a 2-part compound that you mix together, and in about 6 hours it turns rock hard. I cut a notch in the back of the Centra template and inserted a 1/2 inch PVC pipe. After the epoxy sculpt had completely cured, I took it over to the sanding station and refined the shape using sanding sponges. A straight file was used to make sure that I contoured the bevel properly for the tip of the blade. To sculpt the demon's head, I'm using monster clay. Monster clay is pretty awesome because at room temperature, the substance is actually pretty hard. I use a convection oven to melt it down and make it malleable and be able to work with it. Using my references that are on my computer and on templates in front of me, I'm slowly building up the monster clay layer by layer. Up until this point, I only use my hands to move the monster clay around. Rarely do I use tools until I start really getting to the defining stage, because if you don't have the scale properly, it doesn't matter how many details you put into it if it's all wrong. One thing that's difficult about this blade is because it has to be symmetrical on both sides, I'm constantly flipping it back and forth, checking the cheeks, checking the teeth, just to make sure that it's all lining up. Once the sculpture has been completed, I take that over to some foam core and trace the image on there. This is going to be the base for my mold box. Using some soft clay plasticine, I start making the lower layer that the silicone will take an impression of for this 2-part mold. I like using foam core for my mold boxes just because it's relatively inexpensive and fairly easy to use. Basically all you do is just take an X-Acto knife, cut it to size, and cut it to any shape you need. The reason I use plasticine for this is because it's very soft, and so it's softer than the monster clay at room temperature. I'm able to push this up to the sculpture, smooth it down with wooden tools or my hands, and it will not deform the sculpture that I have done in the monster clay. As I'm making the plasticine layer, I'm continually building the walls of foam core that go around each section one at a time. You can't do it really all at once because then it inhibits you from getting to certain areas of your sculpt. My mold box has been completed and the plasticine layer is nice and smooth, so at this point I take some sculpting tools and I put little divots into the clay, that way the two layers will join up properly. Smooth On's Rebound 25 is a 2-part silicone. It is an equal mix of A and B. Now normally this silicone is designed more for a brush-on mold, so it is a little bit thicker than the Mold Star series. So in this instance, if you notice when I'm pouring it very far away from it and I'm letting it trickle down slowly. This will minimize the amount of air bubbles that will form in the silicone. This first layer that goes down is usually considered the print layer. It is the most important. You want to make sure that there are no air bubbles in any of the undercuts. So once all the silicone has been poured out, I will go back then with a chip brush and make sure that it gets moved all over the entire surface. This will also help me pop any air bubbles that would have been left in the silicone. After the first layer of the silicone is completely cured, it's time to flip the entire thing over, peel off the backer board and all the additional clay. Now this is a very important step of layer 2. I'm putting down a wax in between the two silicone layers so they do not adhere to each other. Just like I had done before, the print layer gets put down evenly, and then I use a chip brush to make sure that the silicone makes its way all around the entire sculpture. I am making a mother mold for my silicone out of the same 1/4 inch that I had used for the initial blades in the very beginning. This is where you get to peel apart the two layers and see if everything turned out the way it's supposed to. Using a bunch of clamps and straps, I put the two halves of the mold together and then put the mother mold around that. This will keep everything in place while I mix up my resins and get ready to pour. Now, because this is just kind of a test piece, I am actually using the smooth on onyx just because, again, I've got gallons of it just sitting around and it's going to go bad otherwise, so might as well use it for something like this. That way, if it doesn't work, I'm not wasting a bunch of the smooth on 300 that I would normally use. Lucky for me, everything looks great with this, and I've got a super cool God of War Chaos Blade. So now that I have my resin cast, I can go in with my monster clay and sculpt up the pommel that I need for this version. Just like before, using different sculpting tools, dental tools, and my hands, I'm able to sculpt a pommel out, and then using foam core yet again, I'm able to make a mold box for this. Then it's just the arduous task of mixing up more silicone. This is the same Rebound 25, and then using more smooth on onyx to cast this up. Just to make sure I can get everything to line up properly, I super glue on the pommel to the handle using some Bob Smith super glue. Because it all was hand sculpted, there's various lines and tool marks and everything, so at this point I use sanding sponges to kind of refine the shapes and smooth everything over. Once all that's done, I take it back over to the sanding station again, and I use the end of my belt sander to get rid of a little area on the back of the blade. This was purposely left because any of the additional air bubbles that would have been left in the resin would have been trapped in this area and it wouldn't have affected the actual cast. The tooth that's at the bottom of the demon's mouth I also did not include in the sculpt because there are two different versions of it, again, if it's God of War 1 versus God of War 4. So in this case I just cut it flat, added a tooth to the end of it, super glued that on. Using a stone bit on the end of my Fordham rotary tool, I was able to easily dig out the cracks and crevices that I wanted, and then I switched that to a jeweler's bit. That way I was able to get really defined lines in there and have it look as though there are all these hairline fractures all over the blade. The blades were then sprayed with some Rust-Oleum hammered metal silver. Now this worked great because the texture from the hammered metal chemical part of it gave it a really subtle difference to all of the additional battle damage and everything that I'd put on there. Rust-Oleum's antique copper was then sprayed onto the demon's face and the pommel. And then some basic brown was sprayed onto the handle. Now, if you guys notice, I didn't mask off any of these areas, and it's because I will be hand painting all the final details on there. So once all the spray painting was done, I took both of the blades back over to my painting station and did a very generous wash of Liquitex Heavy Body Acrylics Mars Black using a 1-inch mop brush. After the initial wash layer had dried, I then go back in with a 1/2-inch filbert brush, and I still use the same Mars Black, but I do not add as much water to it, and so more pigment gets left on the blade. Using a 1/2-inch filbert brush, I then take some Liquitex Heavy Body Acrylics Iridescent Rich Silver and start highlighting all the metallic parts that are on the blade itself. Golden Brand Antique Gold was then used on the demon's face and on the pommel, and all of this was applied using a 1/2-inch flat brush. At this point you can really see how hand painting makes a difference. The antique copper can still be seen even lightly through the Golden Brand Antique Gold. All these different layers are what give prop like this a lot more depth and dimension to them and give more of a believability for the real world. If this was all just gold or just antique copper, it would appear flat and just not as interesting. Last step before these blades can be considered complete, I took a liner brush and a little bit more of the Mars Black and painted in all the battle damage cracks and crevices. Alright guys, there we have our finished Blades of Chaos Part 2. This time hand sculpted, molded, and resin cast. And I'm really happy with how they turned out. Again, this is how I wanted them to look in foam, but foam with that type of material, you just always don't have the amount of detail you can get by hand sculpting. Of course, going this direction, it takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more cost and materials. And the only other downside is, like the foam ones weighed about 1/2 pound a piece. These clock in at about 3 pounds per blade, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're hefting them around a convention all day, they could start to wear on you. So they're primarily made for display purposes and for awesome photo shoots. Now, I first off want to thank all my Patreon supporters that have been donating recently. And if you guys like this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Be sure to swing back by again for more tips and tutorials. And until then, I'll see you next time.